At the end of last year, I made a video about visual trickery that impressed me over the course of my gaming life. And near the end of that video, I made a promise that I would eventually do the audio version of that top 10. Well, it's time. In case anyone doesn't know, I'm actually primarily an audio guy. I studied music and audio engineering in university, I've independently released 3 original albums, and I have exactly 1 game music credit to my name, which I'll proudly show off to anyone who cares to see it until the day I die. Long story short, my strongest body parts have always been my ears, and these ears have been taking notice of cool tricks employed by game sound engineers ever since I was old enough to move a joystick. So today, let's look at and listen to my top 10 list of sound innovations over the course of video game history. Like all my countdown videos, this one's based on my personal opinions, and the order, while not random, isn't the most important aspect of the video. Are you ready? Let's get this poison in our ears. Number 10. Multitrack music in rhythm games. Did you know that the lyrics to the Parappa the Rapper theme song are actually just the Japanese title of the game, Parappa? Composer Matsuura Masaya wrote Japanese lyrics for the raps in the game, which were then translated by Watabe Ryu, the guy who voiced Chop Chop Master Onion and Joe Chin. Normally, translated lyrics don't sound good, but Parappa the Rapper's raps somehow managed to keep some semblance of hip-hop coolness in spite of that. But that's not why I'm mentioning this game in this list. Parappa's vocals aren't stored together with the backing tracks, but rather are chopped up and stored as individual short sound files, so that each bit can be triggered when the player pushes the appropriate button.
Crack the egg into the bowl.
This also allows the vocals to play back in the order that the player pushes the buttons, which allows for comedic screw-ups if the player makes a mistake.
M-I-X the ball.
The same was done with the lead guitar in Jammer Lammy, and with instrument tracks in later rhythm games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band, allowing players to feel more like they're actually performing the song, rather than just timing button taps to it. It might sound like a minor distinction, but I wouldn't have bought Guitar Hero 3 for Xbox 360 if the music hadn't been done this way. Number 9. Synthesized speech. Around the turn of the 1980s, arcade game developers figured out how to synthesize in-game voices to taunt and threaten the player. Games like Berserk, Gorf, and Wizard of War featured robotic voices saying things like, "Kill the humanoid." And famously, despite the technology being used as successfully as 1980 to produce intelligible speech, 1982's Qbert just couldn't figure it out. I didn't have much access to arcade games at such an early time in my life, but my family did own a Texas Instruments TI-99-4A home computer, whose speech synthesizer peripheral allowed users to hear voices similar to those used in the company's Speak and Spell toys in games like Parsec and Alpiner.
Did you mean to do that?
Fast forward to 2001, and Nintendo would take a distinctly Japanese approach to speech synthesis in Animal Crossing, where character voices were pieced together from syllables. To understand it, you have to slow it way down, but it's easy to imagine KK Slider telling you that side effects may include dry mouth, nausea, and acne. Number 8. Digital samples. From the dawn of video games until the mid-80s, the majority of video game sound was produced via either pulse wave or FM synthesis. You know, the beeps and boops that people tend to imagine when they think of video game sound. Yes, technically Namco's 1980 arcade game Rally X made very limited use of exactly one digital sample, this one. I'm not sure why they couldn't just synthesize that with a white noise channel, but yay for technology, I guess. But after that, things started to get more interesting. NES games of the late 80s, like Gremlins 2 The New Batch and Fester's Quest, used the very limited memory they had available to store a heavily compressed bass sample, which freed up an additional voice of polyphony, allowing for a richer musical character. When I heard the piano and ukulele sounds in Super Mario World in 1990, I was pretty sure game music would never sound any better. The SNES completely threw waveform synthesis out the window in favor of digital samples for everything. It's easy to make the case that the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive's FM synth approach resulted in a more impactful audio character, but if fidelity was your goal, Nintendo could easily convince you, correctly, that digital samples were the way of the future. Number 7. Musical Ultras. With all the talking about Killer Instinct I've done, I guess I shouldn't be surprised if people think I'm trying to be some kind of dude.
So cool.
But KI 2013 really does deserve respect for what it does well. As I said in my video on groundbreaking video game visuals, Killer Instinct's attitude goes a long way, and a large part of that attitude is in its sound. Yes, the absolutely radical soundtrack that Mick Gordon produced for seasons 1 and 2 is a big part of it. But bro, do you even musical ultra?
Finished!
You feel like you need a cigarette after you watch one of these. It's simultaneously one of the coolest and dumbest things a fighting game has ever done, and I love it forever. Number 6. The music of Samurai Showdown. This next one is less a technical achievement and more of a bold design choice. Not too many games have gone with classical Japanese theater and festival music for their sonic backdrop, but the Samurai Spirits, also known as Samurai Showdown series, has done that from day one. Instead of the tinny rock instrument samples that pervaded so many games of the time, the early and mid-90s, SNK went with wadaiko, kotsuzumi, shakuhachi, koto, shamisen, and even the vocal flourishes that often accompany no and kabuki music performances. They scored their weapon-based fighting game with music that followed classical Japanese compositional conventions, deftly setting the stage for some epic Edo period combat. The market for commercially released video game soundtracks, which had a huge head start in Japan, resulted in the sales of not only original soundtracks, or OST, but also arranged soundtracks, or AST, collections of game music that was being covered, either through sequenced synthesizers or, if you were lucky, with real instruments. The Samurai Showdown 3 AST had all the tunes from the game performed by real players on real Japanese traditional instruments, and it was awesome. Even better, the PlayStation port of Samurai Showdown 3 went with these arranged tracks for the game's soundtrack. I happily sat through hellish loading times with that game just to hear the music. And, lest the Japanese traditional music get all the glory, the arranged version of Galford's theme is also a full-on banger. Number 5. Music that doesn't sound like game music. It was pointed out by a commenter on my previous top 10 list that I was clearly a Nintendo kid. True enough, all of my early exposure to the world of Sega games came in the form of visiting a friend's house and playing limited amounts of Genesis. And while the audio of certain games, like the Genesis port of Mortal Kombat, made me wish I was playing the SNES version, some Sega composers knew how to make that console's FM synth guts really sing. Koshiro Yuzo's soundtrack for Streets of Rage, for example, sounded every bit as cool as the latest New Jack Swing jams that were being heard on the radio around the time. And the Sonic the Hedgehog series had big-name songwriters from the pop music world, including Brad Buxer, Nakamura Masato from the band Dreams Come True, and yes, Michael Jackson stepping up to contribute songs. It was also eye-opening when Electronic Arts' 1999 first-person shooter Medal of Honor showed up sporting a fully orchestral soundtrack by film composer Michael Giacchino. The ability to record basically anything and use it as background music in a game was afforded by another technological milestone which will appear later in this list. Number 4. Immersive Foley sound. Speaking of Medal of Honor, I remember how good it felt to pick up a med kit in that game and hear the sound of someone tearing off a piece of surgical tape. Or pick up ammo and hear it clattering into my standard issue backpack. Foley sound, the practice of recording real-life sound sources, usually in studio, for use as sound effects in media, is a science all by itself, and a science to which first-person shooters throughout the course of history owe a lot of their immersion and realism. As better and better media formats and storage capacity paved the way for more and more data, the sheer number of sound files associated with a typical game grew exponentially, as did the potential for procedural sound generation and real-time sonic processing. The sonic experience enjoyed by players was brought closer and closer to what could be perceived as real. In the Battlefield series, the use of realistic sounds of gunfire processed just the right way makes a multiplayer match feel highly immersive. While I've tended to prefer the gunplay of Call of Duty over Battlefield over the years, Call of Duty has spent a long time catching up to Battlefield in the audio department. Play a recent Battlefield game either with good headphones or a good speaker setup and you'll know what I'm talking about. Number 3. 8-bit sound effect construction. Earlier I referred to the limitations of Nintendo's third-generation machines, the NES and the Famicom. With only 5 audio channels of polyphony available, which all had to be shared by both the music and the sound effects of a game, programmers had to be pretty crafty to get compelling sounds out of the hardware, and yet a number of sound programmers of that time period were able to do just that. There are a few examples of developers achieving shocking levels of realism in their 8-bit sound effects, with practically no use of the PCM channel, a real exercise in programming economy. Some of the sound effects created by Sawa Kazuo for Downtown Nekketsu Monogatari, River City Ransom to You, are downright astounding. It blows my mind how good these sound, and they help make the game feel good. But sound effects don't have to be realistic to be compelling. When I think of powerful 8-bit sound effects, a number of developers come to mind, but one that really stands out is Konami. Their aptitude for combining elements from the pulse wave and white noise channels to create impactful noises like explosions and slamming doors is the stuff of legends. Number 2. Red Book Audio. Nintendo fans can easily make the case that the Nintendo 64 was capable of better graphics than the Sony PlayStation, whose texture warping problems make me cringe to this day, but the PlayStation had the decisive edge when it came to sound. Storing games on a disc rather than on a cartridge allowed PlayStation games to use Red Book Audio, a format named after the Red Book that contained the specifications for compact disc audio storage.
But you don't have to take my word for it.
Now, anything that could be stored on a CD could be used as game music, limited only by the format's 700 megabyte capacity, minus the space needed for game code. A lot of PlayStation titles that used this audio format could be played in a regular CD player, which meant that finally I could make a mixtape of hot tracks from Battle Arena Toshinden 2 and listen to it while I drove around in my mom's Geo Metro. But CD audio doesn't have to be used for just music so long as the developer only ever requires one pair of stereo tracks to be played at once. So if you mixed a stage's ambient sound and music into one recording, Red Book Audio had you covered for both. Callisto Entertainment's 1997 action horror game Nightmare Creatures did exactly this, successfully compensating for some of the game's graphical ugliness with audio excellence. Number 1. Dynamic soundtracks. The idea of game music changing to match the in-game action is an old one, but it's got richer and more sophisticated as time goes by. In fact, the first game with music in it, Space Invaders, technically had a dynamic soundtrack way back in 1978. The monophonic 4-note melody sped up as the invaders dwindled in number and increased in speed. But that was just the beginning. Walk with me through this timeline of some of the highlights of the evolution of dynamic soundtracks in games.
Scorpion win fatality.
Punch! Jump! Knock! Once more now, kick! Punch!
Into the heat of battle. Go for it. Let's go.
There are more and more examples of excellent audio in games, but when it's done well, it elevates the gameplay experience to a new cinematic level. I'm probably leaving something out of this video. I made my list based pretty much on just what I remembered from games I've played throughout my life. So, if you know any big ones that I missed, leave a comment and let me know. I appreciate every view, every comment, every like, and every one of my subscribers. My name is Jesse Jace. Thank you for watching.